and so I guess everyone feels that they win if they survive.
Welcome to the Classic Adventure Gaming Podcast. My name is Gus, and for this episode, we got Josh back in the house. Josh, how you doing?
Doing great. Super excited to be back. Had a little bit of a break there during the holidays, but really excited to have the full panel back going over world building today. So it's going to be a really fun topic. Super excited to be back.
Yes, everyone, you are in for a treat. We have got a special guest as well as the normal panel. We got Rob Conley joining us. You might know him from his blog, Bat in the Attic, as well as several products that he's released over the years around the wildlands of high fantasy. And he's got a few new products that he's coming out with. We'll get into those and discuss those during the podcast. But most recently, he's launched a Kickstarter called How to Make a Fantasy Sandbox, which is a series of blog posts that I actually used quite a bit when I was just getting my feet wet with adventure games. So it's going to be a pleasure to talk to Rob and have this conversation with the panel. So without further ado, let's get into it with the boys. Welcome, everybody, to the panel of our esteemed guests as we discuss the topic of world building in fantasy adventure games. We are fortunate enough today to be joined by Rob Conley of Bat in the Attic fame. Rob, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience?
Well, I appreciate you guys having me aboard. Yeah, I write the Bat on my Bat in the Attic blog. I mostly write about sandbox campaigns along with the other stuff I'm interested in, like GURPS, my Majestic Fantasy rules for OD&D, and I have a YouTube. I don't have a YouTube channel. I'm on a YouTube channel, Random Party Generator, every other Friday. And I've been at this a while, since the mid 2000s, as most of you know.
Excellent. Appreciate the introduction. So, we pointed out, the topics for today are going to be around world building in your games. And as we try to do, we're going to try to leave you guys with best practices and some ideas that hopefully will enhance play at the table for everyone that can tune in and listen. So, Josh, I'll turn it over to you for the topics.
So to start things off, when we're talking about world building, the term sandbox comes up a lot. Why don't we go through and maybe we can try to define what a sandbox is in the context of fantasy adventure gaming?
You want me to kick it off a little bit, and then you guys can refine it further? I'm sure most of you are more knowledgeable than I am. But as far as my understanding goes, like a sandbox campaign is kind of this is used in contrast with the more like the regular sort of linear or narrative campaign that was pretty popular in the 90s, 2000s, and is still used a lot with traditional RPGs. With the sandbox campaign, the idea is that basically you have an open world, so you do not have a predetermined narrative or path that the players have to follow. Instead, you create a sort of like interactive world for the players to explore. They more or less pick their own direction. You might have hooks or various ways to sort of like goad them in one part, but the crucial element here is that they they sort of like determine their own path, and they may explore it as they see fit.
I think that's probably the main driver that everybody thinks of when they think of sandbox, is that it's player agency over DM agency. Lots of different locations around. People can just pick where they want to go, and it's less of the character arc, plot arc type of a world or a game.
So sandbox to me is basically a little bit more nuts and bolts. Is I describe where the players find themselves. They have some information about where they come from, where they are right now, and from that they can decide to do anything they want. And I hopefully prepared myself to follow up with whatever they chose to talk to, wherever they chose to go, and whatever they chose to explore. And it just, and the consequence of that determines what I have to work on next. And then and then they deal with that. And then it just keeps building until, you find at the end of the campaign, you find it's all been driven by the player. And it can go in crazy directions depending on what they're interested in and what they want to do.
Campaign driven by choices and consequences is, I think, a key part of it. That you act, you react, the world is in motion, and it sort of keeps going on and developing with its own momentum. And what is, I think, most important is that it can be open-ended on different levels. You have freedom of movement, you have freedom of action, you have perhaps on some level the freedom of choosing your adventures, picking your sort of where you want to adventure, what kind of objectives do you want to undertake. And on higher levels, you can see these sort of integrate into a larger scale player objectives, larger scale goings on into the world. So you can start from the bottom and you can scale it up into a bigger complex thing if you wish to.
Yeah, and looking at the actual analogy of it being a sandbox, a child sandbox is only going to be as fun as the kids playing in it, right? So just like the rest of the fantasy adventure games, the campaign in a sandbox world is only going to be as good as the players make it. You can put all the interesting stuff that you want in there, but it's completely up to the players what they want to engage with and how they want to engage with it. So they really set the pacing and the tone of how the campaign's going to go. Or you could just have, a sandbox with all the interesting stuff in there, and you can have players that, don't find certain levels of motivation, and it could just be, pushing around sand a little bit. So it definitely puts a lot of the weight on the players to help make it interesting.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, it's you need to have sandbox players with a sandbox world. You can't only have one and have the campaign work off. So lots of people are intrigued by the idea of running or playing in a sandbox world. But if you haven't exercised agency in a campaign ever, and you still are kind of that type of player where you're waiting for the signal from the DM, like, this is what I'm supposed to do tonight. Like, that's the first thing that you have to kind of get out of. You have to be willing to just get out and move and interact with the world and find stuff on your own.
Well, I found the way to overcome that is basically back when, sandbox campaign's been run forever, but the term wasn't really coined until about the mid-2000s, when those of us worked on the Wildlands box set were trying to tell people what this $70 product was good for. You were part of that, Melon. Then we get a lot of reports of people sandbox trying this and it wasn't working out. And it seems that all these reports had in common, they literally start their player in a blank map and say, go forth and explore. Well, some players would thrive on that, but that is really kind of a niche interest. And what I figured, and I didn't have that problem. And I figured out what I was doing different. What I realized what I was doing different is when I sat down, before a campaign, I asked players, well, where do you want to play? I always gave them some information about their context, where they were before they started adventuring. And that gave them enough information to say, and I gave them information about the stuff they were interested in too. So between that, when the groups first came together, they discussed what they wanted to do. They had enough information to make a plan about what they want to do. And that seemed to be the trick of making sure of having a successful sandbox each and every time. And to get people who are not normally comfortable with agency to start exerting agency, because they have that information in front of them, and they said, I want to be exploring a forest, and so you give them information on a couple of forests they explore, and now they have some choices, and they ease themselves into it.
It certainly helps to give the players sort of an initial a few hooks or an idea to grasp on. Some of the sandbox games that I attempted and failed because I didn't communicate clearly with the players originally. I just thought they would love the idea, but some didn't quite understand it. And over time, I find it helpful to start with a sort of kicker, like a treasure map, like having to survive in a hostile environment like a desert, or having some sort of distant idea, like a distant goal that they might be working towards, and it helps to build a party, build a team, and put things into motion. Because once it starts escalating and they start interacting with the world, it works out. But perhaps you have to help them make those first few steps.
I think that it is the case that on the DM side, you have to move away from a mental model where you have a low amount of information given out, but all the information is relevant to. You're throwing out information all the time, and everyone understands that its immediate relevancy to the party varies. And like you said in the beginning, prime the pump, high relevancy, you're actually just like kind of telling people, here's some stuff exactly like what you're talking about, and then it kind of transitions out to where this information just starts filtering in, and it may or may not be relevant to what the players want to do right away, that they're the ones letting you know if it's relevant by what if they latch onto it. But information has to go way up for sure compared to a lot of campaigns I've seen run that aren't sandbox.
Okay. And then, so for someone who's designing or building, Prince, did you have something you want to say?
Oh yeah, I was going to say that I, when I ran Carcosa, that's kind of like something I started doing gradually because I was also very inexperienced with OSR play and with sandbox play in particular. That in the beginning, I had them, whatever they were on the river shore as like prisoners basically, and like their starting equipment was what is found in the wreckage after a battle, and you get plunked on a map. But then you actually you figure out that you should actually give them, you should give them like some, I believe they're called like hooks, or at least some interesting sort of directions to riff off of, because they at some point they do kind of get like especially in the beginning they're kind of like stumped, but over time they'll either create their own goals or they'll start following up on interesting leads that you indeed sprinkle throughout the campaign as you go along. That was my contribution.
Yeah, I think that absolutely makes sense. And so what about for when a DM is actually going ahead and getting ready to design a world to have their sandbox game in? What are some of the essential elements that they should be thinking about including? Or what are some of the most important pieces?
So when I prepare 3 items. I prepare NPCs, and these can include creatures, as well. I prepare locales, and when I prepare locales, I take my overall map and pick the locations that I think that are likely the player is going to be interested in based on what I talked to them before the campaign, and flesh them out in detail. Basically, make a module out of them. But I try to write them as they existed in that particular moment in time, as opposed with some idea for a plot or a linear type adventure. I write it like, okay, this takes place in the year 1033. What is like here, and then who are inhabited. And then the last, I call my bag of stuff, and these are more generic items that, in case the players go left instead of right, I have something to use that I could just throw out on the board. Generic NPCs, generic peasant hut, generic guardhouse, generic tavern that I can just rely on. Usually, I don't have to do too much because I've been at this so long. But for somebody starting out, they probably don't have a whole lot, so they have to start collecting that stuff so you have something on hand, so you don't feel like you're in a jam when the players don't go the direction that you expect.
Yeah, I think all of that is probably pretty similar across most people who put together sandboxes. I mean, I try and think about the starting location if I know where that's going to be, right off the bat. What's around it, I kind of go in a ring out from it. If I'm playing a sandbox campaign in a world I've already created, or if I'm running a Greyhawk campaign or whatever, then a lot of the big stuff is already done, and that's probably a good idea for people who are doing their first sandbox campaign is to use a world that is already built but not fully detailed. I think because you want to hone in on the things that you haven't done and try and minimize having how much you have to deal with until you learn each aspect, I think. But treasure maps are one specific thing I would throw out there. I think that every sandbox campaign DM needs to have 10 or 20 treasure maps in their hip pocket to throw out and treasure all the time, because especially as players are learning sandbox play, treasure maps are just a very easy fastball right down the middle. They're just found in treasure. And if people don't know what they want to do, you can still get a session in, because they'll be like, hey, what about that treasure map we found 2 sessions ago in that horde? Let's just go find that. And those things can all sort of lead into more exploration and stuff in the world.
I would add, if you look at a lot of these sort of wilderness encounters, it can seem kind of like isolated or random. And what I saw, and that was also the case in Carcosa, what I see in some better sandboxes out there is that there will be sort of events or encounters that have a connection or link back to some other area in the sandbox world. You kind of get a sense of not just the fact that it's alive, but you're also these hooks that you're or sort of these leads that you're sort of like sprinkling around all the time. This kind of like happens organically, so that, as you say, if the players don't have a strong objective that session, they can always decide to like follow up on that clue or that lead or whatever.
No, when I blog, just briefly, when I blog about that, that's exactly right. And when I blog about it, I call it world in motion. I didn't come up with the term; somebody else did. And to my shame, I actually remember, I knew who it was, and I don't remember anymore. But world in motion is the blanket term I use to cover all those techniques. And it's very useful.
Yeah, certainly very, very, very relevant. And when you sort of make a sandbox setting or a campaign, it's usually fairly useful to construct it from smaller elements. They can be done piecemeal. You only need maybe 1 or 2 larger adventure sites, which you can develop over the course of play, or you can insert modules. But it is quite a good approach to make multiple small things and link them together, connect together. This is a good building method. It also makes it easier to cut costs if the players go in some other direction, so you don't lose that much stuff. You can reuse it in a later campaign, so no problem there. And I also wish to reiterate the importance of connecting information, rumors, sort of connections, leads, and consequences. One thing we don't usually mention is that I also like to write a very brief setting primer for my players. This is generally a few pages, like a general idea of where you are, what are the gods, what are the main areas, who are the important players, just to get a sort of mental picture there. Another way to do the same is Jeff Reins had a sort of a list of 20 questions to answer before starting a campaign, like what's the deal with my character's god, or where can I offload a bunch of valuables? That's a good checklist as well.
I found the name. It was on one of the old forums, and his name was Lord Vreg. We were discussing Sandbox back in 2009, and he came up with the term.
Let's hope that Lord's with us today. That'd be great.
One other thing that I personally tend to do when I'm like quote unquote world building and I'm plotting out that initial area is I try and divide what I'm doing between relatively static pieces that could be NPCs, it could be an adventure location, but I mean these are things that they are what they are, and they're not in motion as much for whatever reason, and I'll usually have a reason for that. And then dividing that from the more dynamic things, the stuff that the actors, NPCs, locations that I expect to change relatively quickly over the course of a campaign, whether or not the players are engaging with it or not, so that I have just an idea of what how to put that world in motion, I guess. So I do tend to make that mental designation, but when I'm creating stuff, is this static or is this dynamic?
Yeah, I try to. I know this must sound like heresy, but I try to make a timeline. Timelines are not necessarily bad. It's just how you use them. If you use them as a rigid timeline, then that becomes a railroad. But I use it more like what a good general would do with a battle plan. It's a possible course of action, and it helps me figure out what I got to do for prep. But it also acts for me as what things I should sprinkle it in to keep that world in motion. What other things are going on.
I'm really glad you brought that up.
And then what makes it different between a railroaded timeline is that I make sure after every session I revise it in light of what the players do or don't do. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, I was interrupting you. I'm really glad you brought it up because I recommend that once you've gotten the world to a place where there's a lot in motion, that the players are really sort of fleshed out, like what the primary regions are, and is that it's good to have a possible timeline that the players can change. Right, the players will do things. They're going to introduce new things. They're going to take things off the timeline. I think that a timeline being there also adds a little bit of reward or consequence to the decisions that the players are making on a macro level. So if there's a conflict that they keep hearing about and they keep ignoring, and it ends one way or another, that's going to have an effect on maybe this war went one way and it wasn't the best for these adventure sites being available, or maybe this adventure site is no longer available. Maybe it's completely gone now. Maybe it was wiped out. Something like that makes the passage of time not so free. I mean, you already have aging rules, but adding a little bit more of a sense of tangibility to spending time frivolously.
Yeah, or meaningful choices, I guess, right? If you can only have if there's multiple things going on at the same time and you ignore one, then eventually that's going to have consequences. Yeah, not easy to do, but a pretty cool element.
You don't really have to do it very elaborately. My method is just to use an Excel table that lists the days as they are numbered, and here and there you put on some event that will happen if the players don't modify the situation. You can also record what they have done over the course of campaign. One of my ongoing campaigns, for example, is set in a sort of a war-torn land called the 12 Kingdoms, and it is under invasion by an enormous Arctic empire amassing its forces and slowly crushing it from the outwards to the inside. And yeah, the players wasted a lot of time and maneuvered themselves into a fairly difficult situation because they didn't take care of building a sort of fighting coalition. And that's pretty good to see develop over the course of a long campaign.
I had a campaign where the players started out. So I had this. You can think of it as like King Arthur's Britain, but it was a Waterlands version of it. But they were on the station on the southern frontier, and the players decided they wanted to be a group of mercenaries, and they were hired by a baron on the southern frontier. But one player, and I couldn't really dink him for this because it was plausible given how he made up his character, and the players were happy with the choice. But one player really wanted to go back to this area that happened in a previous campaign. So the players had a couple of adventures, and they found a large cache of treasure, enough that they could all have a decent chunk of it and buy off their current contract because they were contracted with the Baron for a certain amount of time, and if they broke it, they would be in trouble. But there was a way to get out if they have enough money, and now they had enough money. And he persuaded the other players to buy out the Baron and head up north to this other area where this war was going on. So they did, and of course that threw all my prep out of the window. I had to retrieve my earlier notes and advance the timeline of that, what was going on. So they go in there, they get a new contract, and that turned out to have major consequence. And the players, partially through luck, but partially through good planning, managed to stumble off and bag the enemy king. And then the player who convinced the other players to do this left. He had real life issues they had to deal with. So all these other players said, you know what? We bagged the king. You know what they did in medieval time? We could sell his ransom to King Arthur, my version of King Arthur. Yeah, and you know what? We could take that money and do what we want with it. And they go, yeah, let's do that, because they were tired. At that point in the campaign, they were tired of being under orders. So that's what they did. And the last part, the third part of the campaign, the last part was all of them. They decided to build an inn in the middle of a nowhere that had plenty of traffic. But there was no development. The last part of the campaign was them clearing out the area around where they wanted their inn built. So it was just interesting. I relay that, just interesting how the players' choices had major consequences. How even one player's choice could have a major consequence on the campaign, and how that could lead to something that totally radically future campaigns set in this area. By bagging this enemy king, they completely turned the tide of the war.
Hey Rob, do you run so you run all of your games in the same world but in different areas? Is that correct?
Yes, I generally I will give the players at this when they say, hey Rob, we want you to run a campaign. I'll say I will pick 3 different regions in my campaign, and the players will listen to my pitch for each of them, and they will pick the one that's most interesting. Or the last time I ran into Waterland, the players actually, I didn't really do that the last time I ran into Waterland, because the players came up and said, Rob, you know what we haven't done in a while? What? We haven't played in City State for a while. We want to play in City State. But the previous campaign to that one, I gave them a choice between Verdistan, this region further to the south around a place called Lanap, and another region. And they chose to go with Lanap because the way I portrayed Lanap was it was this good but corrupt city where a good bribe will take you far. So they opted to do that. But yes, my campaign tends to jump from region to region. And so I developed that region for that campaign, and then it sits for a while, and then maybe 5, 6 years from now, we'll revisit that region with a different group.
Yeah, I can imagine too if you're if you're going to do a sandbox game, this is not something that you can expect to sort of develop all at once beforehand, right? So then if you like that style of play, having built up this world already in all of these connections, it's probably pretty rewarding to just move to a different area, and then you can reuse certain elements.
Yeah, so back in 1988, my maps were falling apart. Now I got them laminated, but the lamination, especially blueprint size,
Laminations of the Flame Princess, yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah, the lamination will still lead to lamentations uh, if you overuse the map. So I had a geography minor in college, and and I just got done with a course that taught us how to use light table, vellum, and technical pen. So I redrew my map. When I did that, one of the things I did was I took these sketchy notes that I had on different areas of Wildland, and I made them into areas that are consistent history-wise, but they had a different feel. And, like, I had one area that was more like we had elves, dwarves, humans, halfling, all living together, and, humans, and they kinda cooperate against the humanoid races of orcs, goblins, and then, more traditional D&D setup, and then I had another area that was based around city-state that was more swords and sorcery. So and we had Vertistan, which was more dark fantasy setting. This was before Dark Sun, so it was more like, I don't know, more Jarrig. I don't know if you guys ever remember the Jarrig novels, but or Erica Mellibone. That was the
Oh yeah.
Mellibonians were dark fantasy. Uh, that area of the set of the Moorcock setting was very dark, and so that way, if I get a group of players that because I was bouncing around between my hometown and college, if I get a group of players who wasn't interested in typical D&D, I had other choices to offer them. And of course, because I stuck with this setting for so long, each of these areas got their own nuances. And when the players went out to the where they start to blend in, then you had your own thing. So yeah, it was gratifying. And I wish my note keeping was better, but I kept good enough notes to do what I did later on. So, but yeah, when the thing to remember is you start out small, but you're always building in a world. So if you get bored with what you start out with, you could always go maybe a 500 miles to the west and make something related but different. So that's a good key to keep the sandbox. And eventually, stick at it. You'll have this place that is every bit as detailed as Forgotten Realms or uh, Tecamel or Garanthia, but it'll be yours.
Yeah, I think in time we talked about timelines a little bit. One thing I would caution, I think, more for the wider hobby if they're listening and have never done it and are curious, is that the present is much more important than the past. I think that in our hobby we have a tendency to fixate on the past. I mean, you see this in adventure modules. People will have pages and pages of history and all of the stuff that you do in lonely fun time. Um, but it's very light on what's going on now, how that could affect the immediate future, et cetera. And you really want to flip that. The players, maybe you'll get one or two of those players who are really interested in the past, but the odds of that are very small. Most people, if they're sandbox players, are going to be much more keyed in on what's going on right now and how they can affect it in the immediate future. So I agree with the timeline thing that was brought up. I've talked before about how when you're designing stuff, you don't want to design what happens until the PCs get here because the PCs might never get there. You want to write out what will happen if the PCs never touch it, because that gives you the information to plug into that timeline. It gives you the information you need to make it feel in motion. And then if the PCs do decide to touch it, you have all the information that you need to just extemporize and play it out, because you already understand how these people are operating, what they're trying to do, what they have to do it with. So yeah, I mean, that's how I would basically tie that off, is that you want to always be thinking about the present and the immediate future, and you're just hanging enough of the past on it for the players to make sense.
Yeah, I found a really good rule of thumb to judge. Now, I'll do things like timeline, King's List, just because I enjoy that. But what I give to the players, what I focus on when I run the campaign, the rule of thumb I use, if it's something that would impact how I role play NPC, and in some case, how I would present a locale, then that's the relevant information from the past. Because not all stuff in the past is relevant to how people act in the present. So and I found that really focused the information that I have to work on.
Generally speaking, I would caution against engaging in too much non-functional world building. You might find it useful to have some context, some sort of a bigger picture idea, but if you want to focus your energies, focus it on the here and now and the adventure potential. Basically, stuff like realms lore and that sort of thing has turned out our hobby in a direction that is pretty much the antithesis of fantasy adventure gaming. It's sort of a hobby for world builders, for failed novelists, and that sort of stuff. And what we want to create is action opportunities for player engagement and player initiatives. And I think every piece of information incorporate should help that emerge.
I feel with history, it's kind of a thing where it's almost like and we of course have had the great silly voices debate, the role playing debate, all that stuff. But I kind of feel
we're gonna ask Rob about that for sure. We're gonna see what team
I'll
team
talk
Rob's
about,
on. For sure.
Rob is definitely team silly voices. But now before that, like I'll make my point, which is that I feel like with a lot of this stuff that like a little bit goes a long way, right? Like having a little bit of like a history kind of helps you textualize a little bit so that areas in your game world aren't completely random, right? There's sort of like a little bit of an underlying design, not too predictable, or that where everything is like neatly tied with a with a ribbon around it. But some sort of general direction or context is kind of cool, especially if players can maybe infer. But that's like a little sprinkling. I agree. The vast bulk of the game should be action, right? If you've got a 60-page sandbox, you should have a page of history, maybe 2 maximum, right? Not the this crazy ass Forgotten Realms super skewed inverted relationship that you saw in the later date. That was my 2 cents.
Look at something like a Conan story. It does have context and it does have Howard's Hyborian Age essay behind it. But in the stories proper, you don't get an info dump. You get an adventure against a backdrop where you get the idea that ancient kingdoms and religious rites or whatever, the focus is not there. The focus is on what's happening.
Well, to give an example of what I was talking about, what's relevant in the past, only focus on what's relevant in the past. So in my Majestic Wildlands, I have a culture called the Gainorian culture, which is roughly equivalent to Rome, even though I don't really depict them as a Rome analog as far as their culture. And the thing about the Gainorians, the 2 things you got to remember about the Gainorians is that they believe that they're the chosen people of the goddess Mitra, goddess of justice and honor. And that's pretty stereotypical. But the other thing that comes up from their past, I mean, I got legends and stuff that I wrote up over 40 years of detailing this thing, but really the primary thing that's relevant because it affects how Gainorian NPCs are played is the Gainorian culture has long had a conflict over the meaning of who is a Gainorian. They believe themselves the chosen people of Mitra. You have one side who believes you have to be born Gainorian in order to be one of Mitra's chosen. The other side believes if you believe in Mitra and swear to her, you become Gainorian. And that is something that their culture has never been able to solve. And that's woven, even that they splintered, that their empire splintered into the present day successor states that are scattered throughout the Waterland. Each of these little realms have never come up with a satisfactory answer to that question. And when the players learn about it, all of a sudden, some of these factions that they're dealing with, or rather the NPCs are dealing with, how they behave makes more sense. And that is irrelevant. But there's a whole bunch of stuff from the past that I wrote that I rarely present to the players unless they specifically ask for it because they know I have that chest of notes and they just want to read more about it. Um, I don't present it because it's not relevant to how NPCs are to behave.
Yeah, I think that the one aspect of history and stuff like that that is important, I mean, to include, kind of offer a contrast to what I said earlier, is the stuff that would affect the calendars of the areas that you're in, festivals, holidays. Um, you know, if it's like a republic type area, elections, things like that that occur periodically. There, I will spend a little bit of time explaining what the holiday is, like why the holiday or whatever festival was created, what drove it, the little details of, you know, like what people do during it. And players might never interact with that at all, but it it does go to that part of making it feel real.
Yeah, because what makes a holiday is people deciding to behave a certain way during a certain time of the year. So that, and the players will interact with that. Well, either they may not interact it directly, but they'll be impacted by NPCs acting the way they do because of a holiday.
Well, yeah, bonus points if you can conceive of a way or anticipate a way in which it'll be relevant to play. Absolutely. But I think there's also something to be said for like making that little bit of history as sort of like a framework for your own stuff. I remember when I ran my B2 game on the Pedantic server, and this was not a proper sandbox by any means. It was actually a sort of like a cobbled together mess from various modules. But I had a nice wilderness area um, that I imported via, I think it's Mike's Dungeon. No, Mike's Wilderness by Geoffrey McKinney. But even there too, right? Like players do start to sort of they're like sort of curious, and for yourself, right? You have to give it kind of like a framework of like, oh, okay, this is some outpost on the border of civilization. Well, what is it an outpost of, right? And eventually, people are going to start asking questions or figure out like if they can travel to other places. So like a lot of the sort of this history, I guess, kind of writes itself when you start expanding your map or you're filling in new areas. I ended up drawing some sort of like a continental map even, right? The sort of like this history is sort of like something you have to fill in anyway. But this is again with the admonition, and I still I'm with you guys when we say it has to be still whatever 95% gameable material, please.
Once you've done the adventure sites, one of the things I like to do is if I can describe to myself in just a few sentences what happened here, then I'm happy, and then I can go off that.
Also, one technique, and this is more like an intermediate to advanced technique that you can use if you're trying to sort out what's relevant to the players and what would they be interested. You could actually have the players solve it for you by running a specific campaign for it. For example, I had this Mages Guild. Mages Guild has been a trope of D&D for a while. Some people have them, some people don't, but it's a thing. But for a long time, it was just more of this generic thing, and most players viewed it as a complication, a pain in the ass to deal with, until I said, "Hey, why don't we run a campaign where everybody is a mage or a magic user? See what it's like." And they said, "Okay, we could try that." And we did, and it turned out to be great. I mean, we never did it again, but after that, the Mages Guild in my city state was so much more fleshed out and it was very much a part of the life of the setting in ways I couldn't do by myself because the players came up with these things, how they dealt with the people living in the city, how they dealt with the authority, how they dealt with each other, and who the factions are in the Mages Guild.
This is a great feature of sandbox campaigns, I believe, that they deepen overplay through interaction, and you get as much information mostly as you require. If the players are interested, they will interact more with it. They will engage more deeply with it, and that gains extra details, extra adventure hooks, extra adventure sites. If they just let it stay in the background, then okay, it can stay in the background. It is still there somewhere, but it can stay as a sketch or something that's just for future potential.
I was actually curious about the this Mages Guild campaign. I've obviously this is also like proposals for a game like this have turned up in in various publications. The one that I recall most saliently would be Gazetteer 3, the Principalities of Clan 3, but I believe there was a Bruce Cordell a sort of like proto Hogwarts supplement into E that also played with this idea. I'm kind of curious, like if you have all wizards, do you allow them to take retainers or hirelings that are non-wizards, or what did adventuring look like? Do you all go into a room, cast sleep, and then like after 4 rooms, all right, we're out of spells? I'm kind of curious.
Well, I don't allow them. I mean, it's a sandbox campaign, so if you want to hire retainers, you can.
Yeah.
And yes, they would hire retainers. Now, to be fair, this was run under GURPS, so they had some more options, but they were not fighters. So they did hire people, the bodyguards and stuff like that, to fight for them. But mostly what they did is figured out how to fix it with magic. And they weren't all the same. They weren't carbon copies of each other. They took different spells and they worked as a team to figure it. In fact, one player wasn't a spellcaster at all. He was an alchemist, a potion maker. So he came up. His shtick was during the downtime he would come up with potions. And the other thing, even though we never visit the Mages campaign, we called this a theme campaign, and we ran a succession of them in the 90s. So the next one after this was an all thief campaign, where everybody made a person of the criminal underworld. And the interesting part of that is one player, again, was not done being a mage. And he didn't want to make up a thief. So I thought about it. I didn't, he was a good friend. So you have that friend. You don't want to really kick him out of the group. So you accommodate him. So I figured out, all right, in the criminal underworld, what role the mages would play. If they're not, especially, the Mages Guild, as I defined it earlier, wouldn't be suitable. So I came up with this whole underground culture of magic. And basically there were street mages in city-state, and they were known as foggers, and they weren't as flexible as the mages in the Mages Guild, but what they were good at figuring out how to mess up donation spells, so that they can pull off these high-value jobs without the noble hiring a mage to do a crystal ball or cast augury, or
they were there to do a non-detection, basically.
Yeah.
But that makes sense. Oh, nice.
Yeah, but there was more to it because they were a culture and they were hunted by the Mages Guild, so they had to remain on the low key. And then I ran a campaign where everybody was, one player goes, what would happen if we were the city of guards? What do you mean? Yeah, well, what happened if we were the city guard? And this was run with GURPS, but instead of, normally in GURPS, you would play at the heroic level, which was 100 to 120 points. They played at the normal level, which was 50 points, and they had to deal with the usual assortment of people in city-state, including adventurers. And 100 points in GURPS is like 5th level in D&D. So there were essentially 0-level characters trying to deal with these regular adventurers. And what they did was they came up with techniques and tactics, stuff that I use today. For example, they noticed that you could buy a high-powered crossbow that would do like 5d4 damage in D&D terms. That does a lot of damage and very high accuracy, but you could only fire it once every minute because you got to crank it up. So you fire it once and it was useless for the rest of the fight. So they came up with this squad tactic where everybody would carry one of these crossbows, and the moment they got in trouble with one of these adventure types, they would all shoot. Most of them would miss, but the few of them that hit really took out like half their hit points, and the fight was much more even than that. And they came up with these minor magic items that were easy to enchant for like a stick. So every squad on patrol would carry a stick, and there's a corresponding stick, law of sympathy in there. So when the patrol commander would take a stick out, and the backup patrol, the reserve would be back at the guardhouse. And if they ran into trouble, they would break the stick, and the stick would be broken in the guardhouse. They know the patrol route, so the reserve will immediately head out on the normal patrol route and eventually run into the place where the patrol ran into trouble. And by the time it was done, the campaign was done, the next campaign, let's just say the players did not screw with the city guards after that. Or if they did, they had a plan. And then the last campaign...
Because I assume that, sorry for the question in between.
No.
So the tactics that the players came up with, that you would later on reuse that with like some of the city guard in that city, I assume.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
because
great.
they were reasonable, because given how I was defining magic, the price list I was using, they were cheap and they made sense, and they didn't really make it seem like some weird version of the 20th century either. It still felt like it's fantasy. It still felt like it belonged in city-state. And then the last campaign I ran of that type was everybody, again, ran zero-level character, but they were all members of a single neighborhood in city-state. So you had a character who played a local tavern keeper. You had a player who played the parish priest, and all these guys who were part of the neighborhood. And it turned out the big challenge of the adventure was a vampire was preying on the neighborhood. And the big climactic fight had the players, and vampires are pretty tough. But the players, once they figured out what was going on, they, did a sort of like a Columbo detective, figured out where the vampire was, figured out where it patterned to behavior, and then they set up an ambush, and it was a close run thing. And one part of the ambush was the players dropped a blanket on a vampire and literally started blanket beating the vampire while they were getting up holy water and holy symbols so they could actually stake the vampire and take it out. But that was sort of neat. And after that, they wanted to be regular adventures, so we never really revisited that. But all that stuff, is part of the background of my Majestic Wonderland. And now that I've read up on the history of D&D, I think there would be great values of doing Brownstein one-offs. So maybe you don't want to do a whole campaign like this, but maybe there's a particular area of your campaign that you want to develop or something. Pretend like you invited you were doing this at a convention, and explain it to your character and hand out characters and role play it out and see what happened. Make the notes, and that becomes part of the background. Like a noble court. Maybe you're not sure how to run a noble court. Set up a situation where all the players are nobles, and you have a situation that's developing, and they got to deal with it. And after you're done at the end of the day, you have an idea of how to run your naval courts for other campaigns.
So you guys that's a phenomenal amount of sandbox elements that people can incorporate into their games. So what we try and do too with these fundamental episodes is for the new DM or even new players in a brand new campaign with a new DM and they're playing the game for the first time, kind of distill down what you guys just talked about into these are kind of the essential elements that a new DM should probably start with. And we can do this quickly. It doesn't have to be don't have to talk about it in great detail, but basically the essential elements. And Rob, I know this kind of sets up a softball for you with Black Marsh, but that's also the point as well. So take it away.
Okay. So the whole complexity of these sandbox, especially the ones that me, Melon, EOTV runs, all of you guys run, is that when you hear about us, we have years at this, and we have a lot of scope. But if you're starting out, keep your scope small. You know, Black Marsh is about an area that's 200 miles wide, 150 miles, 200 miles north-south, or sorry, east-west, 150 miles north-south. It has about 40 locales in it. And most of them are just simple lairs, like a panther lives here, some sturges live here. And then when you really start out, when you focus on where the players start out, just flesh out one village, and then focus on the it's 5 mile hex and the 6 5 mile hexes surrounding it. Because if you have limited scope, then what you have all the interconnection stuff that makes up the sandbox are limited as well. And if you notice in my how to make a fantasy sandbox post and soon to be released book, sales pitch there, you know, I start out with a very broad, but what's produced there, it's just a page of notes, and I steadily narrow it down until I'm talking about the details of an island that is 10 miles wide and 10 miles high, that, you know, it has about a dozen details that are important. And that's the key. And then you're going to be detailing people, places, and a small amount of stuff that you can just throw, like random encounters, random rumors, treasure maps, stuff that you can just throw in and use when the players go left versus right. I hope that a good summary.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, the only thing I would add to it is that for me personally, I and just to reiterate what I said before, that sense of dynamism I think is important. I would compare it to if you walk into an amusement park, part of what makes the experience is the fact that everything is going on. So if you've got all that stuff put together and you look at what you put together and you don't know what will happen next in that area, if the PCs don't touch it, then it's like setting up an amusement park, but none of the rides are going. There's no people walking around, and then when the players walk up to a ride, then it starts, flashing and moving. But other than that, everything just looks kind of dead. So definitely take the time to just think a little bit about the dynamics of it and how it will move if the players don't touch it. And I think that then it will start to develop that momentum where they want to reach in and take part of it.
I think this will fit in with what you said. Think of, hopefully people listening to this are familiar with Traveler, that you make a subsector for Traveler, which is the equivalent of something like Black Marsh for fantasy. But for Traveler, it's just a list of stats. And the stats do tell you stuff about the world. But what it doesn't tell you when you make that first initial subsector is how those worlds interconnect. So to follow up on you say, spend on some amount of time when you make up those dozen locales, make up that subsectors, figure out how they interconnect, come up with a handful or a dozen details on why they relate to each other, and that will go a long way to bringing your world to life.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. And the simplest way of looking at it, if you are starting out, is to think about a triangle. It has 3 points. Each of the 3 points are important, and they are each connected in a different way. So you might have a coastal city ruled by assassins. You might have an area of little bandit fiefdoms. That's 1 point. And you might have some religious organization operating in the area. And the conflicts, alliances, and other relations of these 3 points will immediately give you a set of relationships, a dynamic, and adventure opportunities. And you can think about your entire starting area as like these small casings, and maybe even sort of in a rock paper scissors kind of way that these actors operate differently. They have different resources they can draw on. They have different strengths and weaknesses. You don't have to, build a whole fairground with every attraction built at the beginning. But 3, that's a good starting.
No, I just want to add a small point that for those of us who write about this to help other people with the sandbox, while examples are already good, or if you write a sandbox like Mittermark or Westmarch or something, include your version of Rob's note. Just don't present it and expect people to get it. Explain why. You don't have to be verbose, but put a little bit of explanation why things work the way they do in this product that you're trying to show them how to do it. Because that's the biggest thing that people starting out in sandbox is how to make those interconnection. And if they have those notes with an actual example, then it's just so much easier.
I guess my tip would be there's still probably a lot of tools available. I'll be running an AV&D sandbox this year. I haven't yet figured out what the Discord is going to happen at, whatever. But I found like the back of the DMG, but even I believe it was Phyton 2 or something. A pretty good generator for just getting all of this terrain, generating the number of settlements and that sort of stuff. And from there, it's really not that much trouble to sprinkle it with a few adventures that you maybe already know. There's people like Rob and Milan who have written extensively on the subject, right? So it's easier than people make it out to be, and you shouldn't be afraid of making mistakes. When I started running Carcosa, I had no idea what I was doing, right? But you kind of like stick with it. You figure out by playing, you experiment, right? You figure out what works and what doesn't. If it's your kind of thing, you'll be moving upward and onward in a never-ending spiral. So that's it.
Yeah, one of the best sandbox skills you can learn beyond just learning how to DM, how to listen, how to really listen to your players both before and during and after the game. And that way that will give you information that would greatly make it easier to run. Because now then you can anticipate what they're thinking, and thus what you have to prepare, and make it more fun, that it's less work. And what work do you do would be more on point and more fun.
So we've kind of gone over a lot of the stuff for the things that'll actually be inside of when you're doing world building, the different NPC stuff you'll interact with, history, all that great stuff. What about the actual hex map itself where everything's taking place? What are your guys' favorite procedures for generating those, and what tips do you have for building them?
I have a very simple method that works. This assumes 12-mile hexes, so you might adapt it to 6-mile hexes. I simply throw 2d6 for each hex, and one dice, one on the first die indicates a ruin, and the other die indicates a lair. And I just randomly distribute these sites after I sort of develop a few which I intended to be there. And then I fill it up with random generation, connect them a little once a picture emerges, let patterns sort of assume shape in design and later in play. But basically, you just go over the hexes, roll 2d6 each time, and that gives you a distribution of smaller places that you can visit.
Yeah, for me, the biggest challenge in this hobby has always been moving off of a blank sheet of paper to something. That blank sheet of paper is where I have always struggled. So the automation tools that have come out have been extremely helpful for me. So I mean, I use Hexographer or Worldographer now, whatever it's called. I don't know. But I really like the way that it will take the largest scale map, which is what I would use, for my 30-mile hexes, and I can plop out a general area on the 30-mile map, and it automatically at the 6-mile and the 1-mile level, the 2 levels below that, will, based on what I did at the top level, it'll automatically start putting variations in the terrain down at the lower levels from that. So for me, I find that very, very quick and easy. And then I can just go into the 2 smaller scale maps and tweak them. And I have my own personalized, dice systems where I go in and I roll on each hex, and based on the rolls, I might change the terrain around. And I still use the DMG, the 1E DMG, to go through and basically check hexes to see if something pops on them, whether there's a ruin or an independent freehold, stronghold, barren, something like that, a town, a city, a village. Once I get those big elements, then I start, if I pop a big town, then I start developing its satellites and things. So that's what I use. But I mean, that for a beginner person, that might be a little much. I don't know. You might be better off with what Milan was saying.
Well, I would say, generally speaking, the oracular power of the dice, as it is often said, and tables, that will start you on the journey. It will not take you to the end point, but it will give you an initial spark. And that's a very useful method, because it gives you something that you maybe didn't anticipate or didn't think of beforehand.
Yeah. I think the blank page is, you get off that blank page. Don't, if you find yourself sitting there and staring at it for a little while, then pull something out. But don't let the blank page monster stare you back in the face for very long.
I'm actually probably the worst person on the planet, because I've always been a geography nut. And
I'm a professional geographer.
yeah, I guess I could call
Worse.
that. And I did take a geography minor in college. And so it's always been natural for me to do it. And I got to admit, when I started my blog, I didn't have a good way of explaining how I went from the blank piece of map. I mean, once I get the coastline in, I could explain it. But a couple of years ago, I actually figured out something that would be relevant to a novelist, and it's partly because of the advance in computers and stuff. But the thing you got to so it relies on the fact that landforms are fractal. That you can look at a large scale map of a continent and then zoom in, and terrain features, for lack of a better term, hold similar truth at different scale. So what this means for a novice, any novice is listening, you can go to Google Maps, take a picture with your phone, or if you know how to do screenshots, take a screenshot of an area that looks interesting. It doesn't matter what the scale is. Then print it out, slap a piece of paper on it, and if you can work this, better yet, shine a light underneath. Then trace over that, and just put whatever scale you want. This is, put a hex grid on top of it, and and more so, you can not only just take a screenshot of a specific area, you can go to another area that looks interesting, take a screenshot, and join them together to get a larger map. And because the way landforms work at the small and the large, you'll get something that looks totally authentic. Will help you as a guide, so you can say you go down the Chile, and where the desert goes to the shoreline. If you need a desert shoreline, that's a great place. Or in North Africa, they have plenty of desert shorelines there. Or if you want shorelines with lots of swamp, there's places along Mexico, Florida. And so you can use Google Maps, and I think that would be, in addition to doing stuff with Hexographer and a good random dice table, do that as well, and you'll find that you'll have better looking maps as a result. And I've experimented this, and I was quite pleased with the result. In fact, Black Marsh is a map of Holland flipped on his backside, turned around, and I erased one of the coastline, backfilled it with more land.
It's a great method. I have used the same as well. For Helvetia, my historical fantasy game, I took various regional maps of Switzerland, mirrored them, and sort of revised them in my mapping program, and sort of changed the scale a little. That was that creates believable terrain and interesting terrain typically, and highly recommend it.
That goes back all the way to Mystara and even Greyhawk, right? I recall the Mystara world map is just the I think the American continent sort of like flipped 90 degrees.
Zerb, how did you put together, the world that we're adventuring in?
So I started with one adventure, and I let that adventure inform of related sites and related towns. And once I had the that basic area where I wanted to build outward from that one adventure site and its related hexes, what I did is I went into Worldographer and I slammed the randomize button until I had something that I could work with, and then I basically just started molding it like clay to fit my stuff in there, and then I basically made coastlines, I made rivers and streams, and I built towns along those water sources. And I started seeding other adventure sites throughout it. And based on the terrain that I ended up with, what was a forest, what was a mountain, what was the open plains, what was the ocean, what was an island, I started putting some of the adventure ideas that I had in there, some of the more thematic hex entries that I wanted to have be possibly discovered out there. And I developed my own wandering monster tables by region. And from there, I just started fine tuning.
Yeah, 'cause this has been, Zerb's running a campaign for some of us, and it's just been a great world to play in. I mean, playing in Milan's world and Zerb's world, it's like an embarrassment of gaming riches, but they've both done an excellent job.
Thank you. I also read a lot of Echoes from Fomalhaut. I got my inspiration there.
Yeah, thanks.
I think that it's also important, and I want to say this before I get off, that you look at what other people are doing in their hex crawls, and there's a lot of published stuff out there. Milan stuff it's maddening how inspired some of that stuff is in Milan's material. Rob Connolly's stuff is really good to look at from like a holistic point of view. You look at it, you say like, this is a complete region, and you look at how it's put together. You look at John Stater's stuff. He's got a lot of stuff that's, really inspired. Some of it's a little bit vanilla, but you look at it all together, and he's done a remarkable job. Look at what other people done, get inspired by what they did, and aspire to do your own stuff that's your own flavor.
It's standing on the shoulders of giants, and I'm talking about myself standing on
the wilderness of
Wilderness.
Yeah.
Sure, and that's really it's really mind-boggling that it was done so early. The first sort of developed package setting out there after Tecumseh, yeah. And it sort of does just the things we are talking about. Great maps, inspiring key, and just a word of adventure.
One thing I would throw out, I mean, like for people who don't mind a bit of data entry, something that has definitely helped me in the past few years, and I know that Mythmere just did his Kickstarter for the Tome of Adventure Design table software, where it has the Tome of Adventure Design stuff in it, but it also has something to where you can input your own tables. I haven't used that particular one yet, although I did back the Kickstarter, but in Fantasy Ground, when I used that BTT, and now in Foundry, I mean, one of the first things I did is I would go through and input the DMG tables for stuff like this. so that instead of sitting there with a pen and paper and rolling dice, like 15 times to get down to a final result, I just pop it in, I click, one button, and I get just tons and tons of results in a very short order of time. And although it does take a couple of days maybe to get all of that stuff in, if you have the time to do that and you want to world build, I do highly suggest that, because to be able to churn through information until you get that spark is very helpful. I think that too many times, if you're trying to do it all the old-fashioned way with dice and pen and paper, you might not get enough sparks to get that fire going in the same way.
Definitely, if you don't have it, check out the Tome of Adventure design app. It's it will generate a stream of great ideas just at the push of a button.
I use Inspiration Pad Pro, which you can download for free. And yeah, well, when I'm writing my my Majestic Fantasy stuff, like right now, I have a slew of random tables, and even for some of them, I even combine them to make this master stat block. It isn't meant to be a coherent thing. It's meant to be, if I push a button, I can get 20 entries, read them over, and then one of those 20 entries will be something that will make me go, aha, yeah, I can see that. And maybe an entry, there's one element from an entry previous. Okay, that works for a desert. Now I got this desert layer. Now I got this mountain ruin. Okay, that will work. And yeah.
Actually, I have one of these things open. It's called Models Wilderness Location Generator, and it just picks out 50 entries for you, like I'm just reading: Western Altar, Dark Whirlpool, Raven Quagmire, the Swamp, Raven Gore Desert, Eyewater River, Grey Shield Rock, Wooden Lighthouse, all that kind of material. We will post a link in the show notes. And you take 50 of these, discard what you don't like, keep what you like, put it together, and you will get an idea, probably. And that's a helpful starting point for any wilderness adventure or sandbox setting.
Also, one thing I don't think is stressed enough, that if you are using random tables and you get 20 results and 2 of them just don't do it for you, don't hesitate to re-roll just those 2 entries. The other 18 are fine, but you want those 2 aren't. Re-roll until you get something that until the entire list makes you go, aha, that I can use.
This is an adventure of models, actually, that you can select those you want to keep and fill up the ranks with new material until you get your perfect combination.
Yeah, we'll definitely link those up in the show notes. Excellent suggestions.
Yeah, and so I think we kind of already went over this a little bit, but something that's really important that comes up a lot is the procedures that we have for making the world move outside of the players. I think we went over timelines pretty thoroughly, but I'm curious if y'all have any other tools you use for creating that kind of movement in the world.
I mean, if you can be bothered, remember too, this would have been near the tail end of of basic D&D, right? But you could have a whole I guess you could pre-roll all the weather, essentially. Sounds silly, but it's actually it's not bad. It's not bad in concept. This would be coupled with a whole, I guess, sort of like almanac of events that you could just kind of like sprinkle throughout your campaign.
I would even say the method I use that is even less work is just to go into Weather Underground and take a geographic area on Earth that matches up roughly with the geographic area, the geography of wherever you're adventuring in, and then just pick a random day that corresponds with the calendar your campaign rolled, and then just go 1-to-1 from that point forward on Weather Underground for the weather, because then you just look it up, and if people use weather prediction, then you can actually tell them what the weather is going to be in the future. You don't have to ever worry about it.
The tool that I have really taken a shine to in recent years is I ran So this happened after I ran Adventures in Middle Earth, which for those of you who don't know is a adaptation of D&D 5e as a Middle Earth role-playing game. Now, it's not, they didn't take the fighter and the magic users and stuff and just put them in Middle Earth. No, they took the 5e design mechanics and came up with new classes. They don't even have spells like D&D, but they reworked all the stuff, all the classes, all the items, how monsters work, and they make something that's a Middle Earth role-playing game that if you know 5e, it's very easy to learn. But the thing that they added that was new was something called journeys. And what they did was, instead of making periodic rolls for random encounters while you're journeying, the length of the journey matters, the number of encounters you have. But what you do is you figure out how many encounters that the journey will have. You roll them all up, and then you sprinkle it along the way where they make sense. And the encounters weren't specific, like you encountered a monster here or there. They were more general, like a wonder of Middle Earth, or a dark and forbidding place. And if you knew the setting well, it was very easy to find those kind of places along the way. So when I used that, I found out that one thing, travel took a lot less time. The encounters that occurred were a lot more memorable. And so I started incorporating that in my regular games. I didn't use their tables, but I came up with my own. So now, when they were, if I go, like one problem I had with my city-state campaign that took place in city-state was just the sheer number of encounters that's possible when you go into one side to another. If you're rolling every minute, that's like 20 or 30 rolls that could be possible in a 30-minute travel across the city. So now I only roll 6 or 7 times, or a handful of times. And even though, it's assumed that all this other encounter is happening, but they're not significant. The players are not going to care. And now I roll it up and I will show up only the thinker, and I can put them where they make sense. For example, I'll link to this blog post I have. I rolled for a journey up a street. The players were going to somewhere they're staying at to a shop, and there were 6 possible encounters, and or 6 possible encounter opportunities, and I roll them, and it turns out there were only 2 encounters that they would definitely have. And one of them was they encountered street urchins, and the next one was they encountered somebody from the Thieves Guild, basically purse cutting a mark. I found 2 suitable locations along the way, put them there, and those were the random encounters. And it worked very well. And the blog post, and I even made up a graphic to show how it worked in practice. So I find that it makes things operate a lot smoother. So that's the biggest change in how I do things, as far as bringing the world to life in the last couple of years, because the random encounters I do is feel much more part of the setting than they did before.
I think in terms of the world in motion, I mean, we've talked a lot about making stuff happening. We've also touched on a bit on the calendar, but I would like to just really reiterate the calendar for a second. There's 2 aspects of a world in motion, and one of them feels like time actually matters. And if you have that calendar set up, it doesn't have to be some massively detailed thing, but gee, it's Christmas again, right? I mean, we all say that every year, but it's those type of events coming around again, or the adventuring kind of taking a pause during deep winter months if you're in a more northerly location, and players having to plan around these patterns that they don't control that will make the world seem alive. So make it feel like time moves, make it feel like people are doing something if the players aren't involved. And I mean, really, it starts to just take care of itself after a little while. Your players will start to use the calendar too. They'll start planning, things around specific dates, like, oh, we know that this festival is happening, so this is when we want to do this heist or whatever.
So I think kind of one of the final topics we'd like to cover with you gentlemen is mistakes. Folks that are either getting started or have been running campaigns for a while. And obviously you gentlemen have been in lots of different campaigns throughout your tenure as fantasy adventure gamers. What mistakes do you see? What mistakes have you made that you'd like to help folks, or even misconceptions, right, about what a sandbox is, how to interact with a sandbox, those type of things? Just want to get your insights and how to skip those and learn from your experiences.
For me, I think that the biggest mistake going early on was not understanding the difference in the DM's role in a sandbox world versus in a more traditional, we're going from module to module to module type situation. It's not exactly passive, and I think that a lot of people do that. They're like, oh, well, if I'm not just like in the old role of where I basically tell the players what adventure we're doing, and I'm running this largely predetermined adventure, then I just kind of sit back and do nothing. And that's not true either. It just goes to a more indirect role rather than a direct role. So you want to be reading your players. You want to be helping your players engage with the type of the content that they're looking for. But you're more of the facilitator. You're more of the MC rather than the direct ringleader. But it's absolutely crucial that you do that role, because otherwise, if there's no direction from the DM in the sandbox, you will get the deer in the headlight players who there's just too much and they don't know what to do. They don't know what to grab onto, and they're still kind of looking for that leadership. And that goes down the more players get used to sandbox play. But if you're talking about pure novice, players haven't done a lot of sandbox, DM hasn't done a lot of sandbox, be prepared to still help the players find what they want.
You can do that in game and make it near natural. If the group is particularly wet behind me here, it's still a sandbox if they have a patron. But say they're part of a noble's court, they're just a bunch of the noble's flunky, and then they get a bit of experience under their belt. They can go on to bigger and better things, but they could start out in a social situation where there's somebody actually in game guiding them, and then it becomes more and more about them rather than what their patron wants. So just keep that technique in mind.
Yeah, that they can start planning on their own after a while. It sort of takes a jump to go from the style of play that most people in gaming are accustomed to this style we have been discussing here. So one thing is to communicate the idea early on what this play style is about if they are not familiar. As I said earlier, it helps to have a sort of initial hook, treasure map, revenge, survival, nearby dungeon that sort of sets things into motion. And the third one is reducing decision paralysis. If anything can be done, then maybe it's quite often that the players will end up just planning and not doing anything, or getting that deer in the headlights. Look, that's a good analogy. So it's useful that at any certain decision point, present 3 visible options, and that's much easier to decide on than if they have 12. That's also why hex crawlers work so well, because from every hex you can go in 6 directions, and that's sort of, you can grok that. You don't have to go into very deep calculations. You can move from one hex to another hex to yet another, and the way you connect the bits and pieces of the sandbox should also work in that kind of network configuration, at least initially. And if the players completely do off the rails, even more so than customary, that's great. Let's enjoy that to the fullest because it will be excellent, most probably. At least it will blow up in an interesting way.
I would say something I learned while hex crawling. It's not really a mistake, but it is sort of like I feel there's something like almost like a rite of passage or a useful skill to pick up is how to riff off of just like a random roll on a random encounter table. I often, I sort of like, again, while I started playing Carcosa, and I still use that skill today, if you roll a random encounter, how to figure out how to quickly turn that into something interesting where it's not just like, well, okay, combat. Then whatever Milan mentioned, the oracular power of dice. This, of course, also plays into it, right? If you roll what is it? It's a chimera, but he's friendly. Like, okay, well, how does this work? Roll for like figure out something quick, and if you get good enough, then very often, like from that initial encounter, some sort of follow-up adventure or encounter is going to take place. I believe we discussed dragons before as well, and also like, of course, if dragons are pretty rare, especially if they encounter it in its lair, that's not going to go away. They're definitely going to come back later and try to finish it off. So yeah, that's something I would say is a very useful skill if you're going to do sandbox gaming. You can't always anticipate what they're going to encounter, what direction they're going to take. Then something like that can be very useful.
You don't have to develop everything at once. Just stay 2 steps ahead of your players. You roll up,
Yes.
let's say, a random pyramidal ruin. You describe the pyramid, you describe the stairs, climbing up to an entrance and 2 rows of broken columns. Okay, the players investigate. You start thinking about what's beyond that entrance. You roll up the inhabitants, if there are any, and you proceed from there, step by step as they engage with the content of your sandbox. You won't get stopped in your tracks. You will just keep rolling it forward.
I think another common mistake that people need to be wary of is a lot of DMs, a lot of referees will often, I don't know if it's a lot, but some referees will have a firm opinion how things ought to go. And if you're going to run a sandbox, you got to learn to distinguish between things that ought to be because they make sense given the premise of the situation or the setting, and things that are just, well, they're not the way you would rather go, but because you set this up, because it's set up this way, and because the players are making this choice, this is how it's going to go. And so you have to be flexible in that. Otherwise, they're going to run. Because I've heard and seen referees who couldn't let go that there could be other possibilities, and just the situation went only one way as a result.
Yeah, I think that's key. That was actually touching on something I was going to bring up, and that is, and I would maybe compare it to if people have ever been through an author editor process, right? Like people who have not been edited before often kind of fight against the editing. But you have to realize that in this situation, again, this is a very broad analogy. It's not exactly perfect, but the players are the editors of your world. And so if you don't know how, if you're uncomfortable with people editing your papers, then you might also be uncomfortable with players editing your world. But that is absolutely crucial dynamic to a sandbox working. And so you have to develop that comfort.
I think I coined a phrase that covers up. You have to be willing to let players trash your setting.
Yes.
I have a more positive example. It's not a negative example, but it's a positive example. For example, in one session of one campaign, I rolled a random encounter of a drunk guy. The player runs into a drunk guy coming from the tavern. And I was kind of playing it for laugh and, doing, hi, how you doing? But for whatever reason, this player took a personal interest in this drunk guy. I don't know. I didn't try to, I wasn't trying to play him as sympathetic, but he really wanted to help this guy home. So when he gets his home, I'm taking advantage of what Milan said about the oracle power dice. I kind of made some quick rolls to see what this guy's situation, and he didn't have a perfect home situation, so I kind of came up with that. And this consumed the entire session, and to the point where I guess I did a good job because the players. What I do is I do a round robin when this happened. I give everybody about 10 minutes to role play their thing in town. And players started passing on their turns so they could see what happens with this one player and the drunk guy. And he wound up going to the village priest and arranging for help for the drunk guy and his family. And it was crazy. And it wasn't all at all what you would consider a typical adventure. And other than I do award milestone XP in my games. The player got some milestone XP out of that. There wasn't any obvious treasure out of that too. And I know some referees who would not find that interesting at all and would do everything to slough off the player trying from interacting with that drunk guy after the initial encounter. But if you do that, you lead to this very memorable session, stuff like this very memorable session, where the player, in the midst of their adventuring career, helped this drunk guy and his family.
And making memories is all about why we play. So that's absolutely awesome play when the players get interested in something that nobody was expecting. They'll remember that.
For me personally, that's the thrashing or bashing or destroying of the world. It's what I look forward to the most. Like, I love to see what the players are going to do that I didn't think of. That's what keeps me hooked as a ref personally. So like you set up this you set up this very combustible environment, and then you just let them loose in it. And I just like to see how the explosions go off. Like, that's why I play the game.
I lucked out. I lucked out when I was young. I found out quickly when I started playing D&D, I like nothing more. And I was speaking more, I had more of a wargamer's mentality back then. I like nothing better to set up this scenario and see what other players. I didn't necessarily have to play, even though I was the DM. Obviously, I was running the monsters, but I love setting up scenarios and just see what other people do with it. And that's what led me to figuring out how to run sandboxes.
Brent, you had something?
Yeah, I was going to say that it's the if you're not ready for it to be, if you can't ever destroy it, then you can't really interact with it really properly interact with it, right? Like, it's the whole point that, like, if you want to create something that's actually it's actually something that's like worthwhile to engage with, you have to be willing for it to allow it to occur, that the players sort of like might actually set it on fire. Otherwise it's inherently static. Then it's just a backdrop. It doesn't matter.
So this one's a personal one I got just to add on here towards the end. And then if there's anything else, you guys, we definitely want to open it up. If there's anything that came up from the discussion you guys want to discuss. But for me personally, how much is too much? Like, Rob, I really liked your stories kind of talking about how you would expand different sections of, I believe you said Wilderlands, as you were developing it out. Mm-hmm. And then you've used it for decades and decades, right? Where you'd set up an area. If you got bored of wherever they currently were, you say, you know what, I'm going to go check something out 500 miles away. But like, how much, it looks like it developed for you over time, but how much do you truly have to have for people to, at least for your players and your experience, to feel like they have, freedom, agency, let's say a sense of wow and wonder of how vast your world is? How much do you think has to be there, or does there have to be an immense amount of content to engage with?
I think the boundaries of the world field open. There's two things. Okay, so when I'm playing with a group for the first time who doesn't know me very well, one of the hard things I have to do is convince them that yes, they really can go left, because we all talk about the hesitant player, the one who's not sure. That's true, but then you got the helpful players. They perceive you as putting a lot of work into whatever it is about to happen, and they don't want to risk trashing it, okay? Because they know you put a lot of work. It's a very helpful mentality. But so the one player, you have to convince them to interact, but the other player, you have to it's okay to go left. And you do that in a lot of subtle ways that mainly by you don't spend a lot of time on irrelevant detail, but if they choose to fiddle with a mug or talk to a bar patron, or talk to a bartend patron, and then you stare them in the eye and you start doing the funny voice, or maybe just really it's just the first person role playing that does the trick. Then they start to realize, "Oh, maybe Rob is willing to go where I want to go on this." Then the second thing is in that graphics I was showing you, not so much in the random encounters part, but if you notice, I intersperse little bits of commentary. The fight is in front of the Water Dog Flophouse, a known hangout of beggars. And I don't bother explaining the beggars. I do in the graphics just for the readers, but if I was running it, that's all what it would say. And I wouldn't leave it hanging and let the player ask about what beggars were. Because it would obviously, this would be beggars with a capital B. And then I would say, you follow on the right, a sign showing that the building is one of the overlord's official tax collectors. Or if they're in the wilderness, I'll make a comment on a nearby mountain range. And I try to keep it really brief because the whole point is not to overwhelm with information. But doing this developing a pattern and introduce these little tidbits of somewhat relevant detail, but they're not, they don't feel like they have to follow up on it immediately. That's what gives my world that, and the first person role playing and willing to follow through. Those two are really what I think gives my players a sense that my world is expansive. I hope that makes sense. It's a very Zen thing at times, it seems. Wish I could explain it better.
That's pretty good. And I like it a lot. I'm only slightly disappointed because it sounds like you're on Team Silly Voices.
Hell yeah.
Well,
there's Team
okay.
Chad Patricians, which is my team, where we just speak in third person and we use
monotone,
normal voice.
boring, kind of like a
All right,
drawl.
so
Yeah.
to be clear, I only have a limiter. I am not, if you guys know who Rich Little, the comedian, is, I'm no impressionist comedian level ability. I wouldn't say I'm pro silly voices. I am more pro first person role playing. I'm all about, I will stare you in the eye and I will speak as the character. Maybe not the voice, but and I'm not happy with third person. I will do a lot to get, that's really the only hard and fast rule that I'm a stickler about. Speak in first person. Don't tell me what you're doing in third person.
Interesting. So how long do you generally, do you have a time, do you put a time limit on that interaction?
Yeah. 10
for
minutes.
yourself, like internally?
10 minutes. My system management is 10 minutes, go to the next player in the room. If we're in town. If we're in a dungeon, then it's probably less than 10 minutes because, you're in an active situation. But if you're, the most common situation is you're in town, you got 5 players, 2 of them want to go to this shop, 2 of them want to go to this shop. This one person wants to hang out at the tavern. So the way it works is 10 minutes with this group A, 10 minutes with group B, 10 minutes with the last player. And I can handle, in the past, I can handle up to 4 groups of players doing this, or 4 players all doing their own thing. So, I mean, yeah, it sounds like a lot of time, it's 40 minutes going around the table, but you got to remember, everybody's listening in. So they're entertained by what's going on. And they know, and it doesn't go overly long because I will say, we'll put a pin on this. Okay, you're standing in front of the source supply house. What do you do? And it works out rather well. And then when they interact with an NPC, I'm talking to them and staring them in the eye.
So, and then just to give kind of relevance there, how long do your sessions normally go? Like, start to finish? 4 hours, 5 hours, 6? Like, what's your typical length?
Okay, so ideally 4 hours, because I'm doing so much evening stuff. Sometimes they're as small as 2 hours, but 4 hours is typically my max length. From 7 to 11, basically in the evening. I will say a point in your favor. It has happened, not just once or twice, but more than a few times. the players will go to me. Hey, Rob, can we do this shopping trip? Can we just say we shop and just say we go to these places, see what they have, and buy them, i.e., third person? Because it's not so much they don't enjoy it, because they know they have something they want to do, and they know if they do it the normal way, they would totally get sucked into whatever's going on, and all of a sudden, before they know it, the entire session is gone. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I had players ask me specifically, "Can we do this bit of business third person?" And I would go, "Yes, it's fine. We can just gloss over it. Here's what you find." And make a couple haggling rolls, and they get what they need, and then they move out to what they really want to do.
I guess that's me. I'm that DM and I'm that player. I want to get to the adventure, right? And I think that's generally what we encourage here. But I can see like there's scenarios where it makes sense because it's significantly advancing something they're interested in doing. So there's going to have to be. My preference is I don't prefer that to be a shopping situation. For me, it's more of a intrigue situation. So they're trying to get intel on the Baron or whatever. So they have to do some negotiation or some interrogation with someone. So that may take a few more minutes than a normal engagement, but that's personal preference. That's interesting to hear, though. So you do have an internal clock, though, that's going. You're like, okay, if this goes longer than this, I got to shut it down.
Yeah. If I don't know if it's appropriate to call the worst possible scenario, but the most time-consuming scenario, yes, there is a definite personal clock, because I don't want to leave the other players. If it's not fair to the other players, the table, leave their thumbs twiddling. But I did have to learn over the years how to vary my scope, because there are times when your third person approach is the way to go to keep the game flowing naturally.
Hear that, Prince? Hear that?
Well, I mean, this is a lot of cope. What I hear is that, it's actually good. You just need to not overeat, right? You need to not overuse. And I agree with that. Of course, everybody, we're all human beings, right? Sometimes you like a little bit of
Some of us are
atmosphere, you
Dutch.
get carried away, right? I personally, I currently abstract all the shopping too. I don't really bother with that. But yeah, of course, you have it happen. Sometimes you need a little break. As long as the main course, the core activity doesn't get disrupted too much, it's all fine with me.
It's actually so bad it's so bad of a problem. I wouldn't say it's a problem, but it's an element of my campaign that I have on record, because when I run stuff online, I don't keep great notes, but I keep at least record the time and date. I had campaigns where 12 sessions had gone by, but only 3 days in game has passed. And it wasn't combat dragging out either. It was just the players wanting the grind, the experience every hour of every day of their characters' lives for a period of time. And the only problem is that if you award periodic XP, all of a sudden they go from like the third level to 8th level in 3 days. So that's a problem I never really solved for certain systems I've run.
Well, that's all that I had. Did anybody else have anything else they wanted to bring up or discuss?
I think we're good. Team Silly Voices very clearly won this round. Just a demonstrative victory. That's all right. I will give you until the next episode.
All right, I'll bring it up. Okay, give me the context here. What's the deal with Silly Voices in this group?
But they are excluding themselves from the domain of fantasy adventure gaming. There is a heresy that has to be expunged for fantasy adventure gaming to survive.
I think it's more just that when you're trying to run a game for different cultures of players, there's a limited extent to which you can mix cultures, and first person role playing is very strongly embedded in other cultures. So if you take that, if you do a lot of first person role playing, then a lot of times you'll attract players to your table who are there for that. And then it just becomes unproductive mixing of gaming cultures. That's really my issue with it. I don't have an issue with it in in the abstract, but how it typically ends up playing out at tables in large numbers is something that makes gaming uninteresting to me.
Well, I have a piece of advice that may be relevant to the clash of colors or cultures. Um, it is possible to do first-person role-playing with people who just want to get to the adventures. But you have to keep in mind, I don't know if any of you guys been involved in organized sports at all.
Definitely.
Well, think about what you do in the locker room or on the field. You're there for a reason, to play the game, the sport. Yet, obviously, because this is real life, there's first person stuff happen all around. So the thing to remember is keep that kind of if when you engage in person role playing with people who want to get on with the adventure, remember they're only going to be focused on getting on it. If they were there actually doing this, they'll be focused on getting on the adventure. So anybody coming up there and asking them, the drunk guy that comes up to them and starts interacting with them, they're just going to slough it off. And that's a valid response. So that's how you handle it. You only person role play the stuff that's relevant to whatever they're about to do. Just like in real life, if you were engaged in that kind of activity, you were, anybody who tries to prattle on like the latest Metallica album, that somebody's going to say, "Hey, focus on practice, okay?"
I couldn't agree more. I think that's kind of a point we make all the time is as an analogy is sports. And if you look at the ratio of how much banter is happening on the field compared to how much game is happening, if you keep that same real world like ratio in your adventure games sessions, I feel like you'll be fine. And I think that's what it really comes down to. Like we joke with Prince. Prince actually has very talented, silly voices.
Is this a surrender? You're trying to like
No.
sort of do a
No.
sort of
More of
negotiated
a
surrender,
olive branch
like
situation.
as an olive. We have always I've always been on Fritz's side when it, if you just, but it's just we're afraid of the consequences. Well, I accept this surrender.
Credit where credit's due. I definitely don't surrender. I'm just saying, and we agree on this, I think, is that the ratio, as long as it's a sprinkling, as long as it's a seasoning, as long as it's just that quick 20 seconds of banter on the football field in between plays, yes, you can totally engage in a little bit of first person. I'll do direct first person. There won't be a silly voice involved. There may be inflection. There'll be third person if I need to speed it along. But yeah, like I engage with it. There's no question about it. It's just I feel like the ratio needs to be just like you said, Rob, at a sporting event. Like if you're trash talking the whole game, you're definitely not playing the game.
So. Yeah, and I admit it's an art. I wish there wasn't a hard and fast rule, but it isn't. It's an art that you got to learn.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? That we came off of a pretty long period in the guess the late 80s to the entire 90s, even the early 2000s, when the whole point of role-playing games was like the role-playing part. The idea that you were playing a game was like some sort of like distant second. So and that's something that I myself kind of like moved off of playing Dark Heresy, which is very much a silly voices and atmosphere game. But I just noticed actually, oh wait a minute, the immediacy of the adventure, the planning around it, the sort of like engaging with the game world in that way, in that like more sort of like open, but also more like mechanical way, more deterministic. That's like the best part of the game to me. So then it makes sense. But of course, you don't play such a game for such a long time without realizing that like there's a very like a small element to all of that atmosphere stuff that's there for a reason, right? It is a fantasy game, so yeah, of course. We like the silly voices, but I think I'm here in the same camp as everyone else when we conclude that like that is the best part of the game is still it's just this the game element, the exploration of this sort of like fantastical world, the dungeon crawling, all that stuff.
Yeah, that one of the things that really helped me, two things really helped me refine to where I'm at today. And my friends tease me about this all the time. But the first is LARPing, because live action role playing. I played Boffer LARP, not the paper, rock, scissors, vampire the masquerade kind, more the sport kind. But where LARPing really excels is mini on mini role playing. And even though it's not, obviously, it's people pretending, but still, you get to see many people trying to be fantasy characters interacting with many other fantasy characters. So that really has informed me about how to handle life in a setting. Because when you watching people like that, that has its own truth. And then the uh, the second thing is long ago in the '80s, a friend was really a movie buff, and this was before the internet, so you didn't have all these critique sites around like you do today. So he really pointed out the nuts and bolts of how movies work, and that allowed me to pay attention. And of course, especially to the parts where characters are interacting with each other. And I started filing away certain moments that I've seen. You know what? I ran into that campaign. I wasn't sure how to deal with it, but now I do. So when you go watch or read a book, even pay attention to the times to enjoy them, but try to analyze them afterwards and grab some of the moments that you can file away into your bag of stuff that you can use when you need to role play, and you will help. And just like we were talking about, what the banter on the playing field, you'll see examples of that, and you see the different styles of banter on the field. And that's when you get those kind of players, you'll have that stuff in your bag of stuff to pull out to use in your campaign to make a better sandbox.
Very nice.
Alrighty. Well, yeah, that seems like. Is there anything else anyone else wants to go over? It seems like kind of a good ending point.
Well, yeah, Rob, can you, before we officially wrap up, let's give Rob an opportunity to plug his stuff. So, Rob, what do you got coming up?
All right. So well, I have already released Black Marsh, which is a small setting, 200 miles by 150 mile. It is free for download, but the print copy I am selling for a profit. But it's a good price. Uh, I don't have it in front of me, so forgive me. It's like 12 or 10, 12 bucks, for the soft cover, 15 bucks for the hard cover. No, 20 bucks for the hard cover. Prices went up in about 15 to 12 bucks for the soft cover. And they're digest size now, so they're even easier to use, more compact. I have my Majestic Fantasy rules, which are compatible with Swords and Wizardry, 100% compatible. I rather than radically altering the game, found ways of adding to it to do the stuff I do in Sandbox campaign, which, among other things, include, I know this is a heresy, a skill system. But the reason I have a skill system because players like to do stuff other than spellcasting and combat, and they want to be better at these stuff. So I figured out a way to have a system that's consistent with how Swords and Wizardries work, and classes that are focused on being better at stuff other than spellcasting and combat. And now I'm about to release How to Make a Fantasy Sandbox, which is basically I have this procedure where you can start from scratch on how to build your own setting. And it's not about building an entire world. You sketch out a world and you pick a part of it, detail it down to the form where you have everything you need uh, for to run a sandbox campaign. Basically, it's building your NPCs, your locale, and your bag of stuff. And I just had a very successful Kickstarter, and I appreciate anybody listening to this and you guys on this podcast who backed it. And it will have this Kickstarter had three stuff for it. It had Black Marsh, the digest version of Black Marsh, which has already been released. It will have the How to Make a Fantasy Sandbox book, and it will have the example setting, the island of Paid, that I use for an example. It will have it as its own standalone setting And so all of those will be available. And then the next project I'm working on is Into the Majestic Fantasy Realms, which takes Black Marsh. It takes one of my points of light settings, Southland, which I designed. Well, I designed Black Marsh because it came after to be north of Southland, and expands around them. And it also, a while ago, I made a map 19, the Wild North. Well, for the Waterland of High Fantasy, since that was my original work, I took it, redid the southern edge of that map so it adjoins Black Marsh, and I filled that out. It will be 4 poster size 12-inch by 18 maps, and a bunch of ancillary maps there too. That'll be with the package, and it will be with a guidebook covering all 4 maps, and that will be available. Hopefully, there'll be a Kickstarter for it this summer, and that will be something to look forward to. And that will be, given the situation with Judges Guild, and I'm no longer a licensee, that's going to be my replacement for the Waterlands of High Fantasy, and I'm going to expand that in future products so people can build on it. And I also plan to have a system reference document, so if people want to use part of it or all of it for their own stuff, they are welcome to do so. I expect what we will find is people in all to date, for Black Marsh is the same way, but to date, what people have used for it is I had one guy use it for a different RPG, a Fantasy Trip clone that was done before Steve Jackson reacquired the Fantasy Trip. And the other is somebody did a Hungarian version, somebody did a French version. There's a people in Spain who used it at the core of their own setting for their Spanish OSR RPG. So it's just starting. So I hope people adapt it for their use in other places of the world and get a lot of use out of it.
Oh yeah.
Sounds very exciting. Well, thank you all again for being on, and we appreciate your time. We appreciate all your insights and all your experience and sharing with the audience. So with that, we'll call it an episode. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that was quite the episode and such a great conversation with Rob and the rest of the guys. Got a lot of great insights coming from them around how to create your world, make it something that's living and interactive and incredibly gameable for your players. So yeah, I just want to thank Rob for coming on again. I really appreciate his insights and sharing, his expertise from the time that, he's been invested in this game for decades. So definitely a lot to learn from him, and appreciated him coming on and sharing what he had with us. So Josh, what did you have on? What were some of your takeaways?
Yeah, I thought it was a great episode. It's one of those things where we spend a lot of time in VCs talking with Milan, Zerb, EOTB, and Prince about this kind of stuff. But getting to hear from Rob, who's someone with a ton of experience, not just with 1E, but also things like GURPS, just gave a lot of different perspective to the topic that was just really informative. And, I heard some new things that are really interesting I'm definitely going to use. So it was a really useful podcast. And yeah, I was super happy to be here for it.
Totally agree. So if this is your first time joining us on the podcast and listening in, we appreciate you. And we appreciate all of our longtime listeners. And if any of you are not currently in our Discord, you should come over. I'll have links in the show notes to that Discord where we interact with everybody. Come on over, ask questions, interact with all the guys from the panel. Rob is in there now too, so you can probably message him if you got questions about his Kickstarter or his products. And then obviously we like to chop it up and have a good time and share the particular projects we're working on, as well as the games that we're running, and just discuss all things fantasy adventure gaming. So thank you all for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.